Wonderful. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be having part 4 of our seminar, How does the mind discover useful abstractions? This is a 4-part seminar. We've had already part 1 on causal abstraction, part 2 on perception and action, part 3 on language, and today we're going to have part 4 on memory. And the goal of this CogSci workshop is to understand abstraction across these domains. So we're having this seminars happening on Zoom where we discuss abstraction in each one of the specific fields, and then on site at the conference next week, we'll have, is it next week already? Crazy. Then we'll have a discussion that will try to kind of unify the ideas of abstraction across fields. So for today's sessions, we're going to have roughly 30 minutes for part 1, where each one of our 4 speakers will give an opening statement. These opening statements should be, to the extent that it's possible, with maximum of 5 minutes. And then we're going to have brief questions, only like very pressing questions for clarification after each one of the speakers. And then at the end of the 4 opening statements, we'll have 30-minute session, approximately, where we're going to have a panel discussion, which I'm going to moderate, and everyone is welcome to chime in with questions, including the speakers themselves. The first opening statement will be by Chris Baldassano. Chris is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Columbia University. His lab studies how the human brain is able to perceive and remember complex real-world experiences. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. Next, we're going to hear from Anna Leshinskaya. Anna works at AI Objectives Institute, leading a research program in AI alignment. And in her research, Anna uses functional MRI to understand the use of semantic memory and how semantic memory is updated from experience. Thank you, Anna, for joining us. Next, we're going to hear from James Whittington. James is a Henry Wellcome postdoctoral fellow working at Stanford and Oxford universities. And his goals are to build computational models and theories for understanding structured neural representations in brains and machines. And finally, we're going to hear from Alexa Tompary, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology or Psychological and Brain Sciences at Drexel University. And in her research, Alexa uses or studies how changes in the brain over time alter the way we remember past events and how we integrate new experiences with each other and with prior knowledge to build new knowledge. Alexa, thank you for joining us. So the opening statements, which are going to be going now, will address 2 major questions. The first question is, what concrete phenomena does a cognitive theory of abstraction need to explain? And second question is, what characterizes useful abstractions in the domain of memory? So with that, Chris, take it away. Are you able to, yeah, can stop sharing and you can share your screen now.
Yep, I think that's working. Great. Hi, everyone. So I'll try to keep this quick. So I'm actually going to reverse the order of the questions here and start by thinking about what do we mean by having a useful abstraction in memory? And I think we could even zoom out a little farther to ask, what do we mean by there being useful memories in general? So what is the purpose of memory and what sort of adaptive purpose does it serve? And I think one of the main reasons that we have memory at all, and maybe if I'm going to be provocative, maybe I'll say like the reason that we have memory, is that it allows us to make predictions about things that we can't currently see. So things that are either in the environment right now, but we can't perceive them, or things that haven't happened yet. And so it allows us to leverage our past experiences to make those kinds of predictions. So we can predict things like what is going to happen in the world next, what am I going to perceive next in the world, and it also helps us answer sort of hypothetical questions of what would happen if I carried out some kind of action, what kind of consequences would there be, right? And we can use our memories to try to make these kinds of predictions. And so in order for these predictions to be useful, I think about that we want to make sure we're bringing online only these relevant pieces of memory. And so we want to activate the memories only if they're relevant for the current kind of situation we're in, And we want to make sure that we activate all the relevant ones, right? So we want anything that's related to, that's going to help us make predictions to come online and be available to us. And anything that's distracting, we don't want to come online. And so what this means is that the abstractions need to make sure they retain the features that let us activate them at the right times. So we need to make sure that we have an idea about how to discriminate between the different kinds of abstractions that we could have. And at the same time, we want to remove any features that are not actually important for discrimination. So if there's features that are not actually important for predicting in this domain, we don't want to include those features because that's going to make it more difficult to activate those memories, right? If these are things that are not actually critical for the situation we're in. And so what this lets us do if we have these kinds of abstractions is to apply this knowledge we have from the past to new situations that we think are of the same type. Right. So if we like in the words of one of our great poets of the modern age, Taylor Swift, right, one of her songs, she says that when she's talking about this relationship that's going bad, saying that I think I've seen this film before and I didn't like the ending, that this like exactly what's happening in the relationship isn't identical to what's happened in the past, but this to her is bringing up this memory of how these bad consequences in the past, and this is telling her she needs to get out of this relationship. So we can think about what are the sort of triggers of these abstractions that are going to cause them to be activated, and what kind of predictions we're going to make. And so there are many different kinds of abstractions we could think about. In my lab, we're often interested in abstractions about event types. And so, for example, if you read this little paragraph here, that John was feeling hungry as he seated himself at a table. He saw the waiter approaching, but suddenly realized that he'd forgotten his reading glasses. And so you should be able to understand something about what's going on here, right? Why is he worried about his glasses? And the answer is, of course, that you're able to pull online this knowledge you have about how restaurants work, right? You were able to recognize that this was a restaurant, even though we didn't tell you explicitly. And you could realize that your predictive model tells you that he's hoping to read the menu to make his order. And so my lab and others has looked a lot about how we build these kinds of abstractions and how we activate them. And so I think about the kinds of things we try to study. There's a whole category of questions about how we actually create these abstractions. I think this is actually in principle, super difficult thing to do, of how do we take these individual experiences we have and figure out what are the important pieces that are actually going to generalize to the future. How do we know when to pull up the right abstraction, and what happens if there's multiple past memories that are relevant to things that are happening? And finally, from the neuroscience side, thinking about how we actually represent these things in neural systems. Great. I have
Thank you very much, Chris. Yeah, if anyone has any burning questions, you can have them now, either throw them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself to ask them directly. And meanwhile, maybe we can have Anna set up her slides as well. Okay, so it looks like no questions, so we're gonna power through. Anna.
All right, thank you so much, Marcelo, and all the organizers and everyone for being here. As Marcelo mentioned, I sort of had an institution shift. So I was at UC Davis studying the neural basis of semantic learning, and I'm now at AI Objectives Institute using cognitive science tools to understand AI alignment. So talk to me more about that at any point in the future. But for now, I am going to try to answer this question: what cognitive phenomena and memory does a cognitive theory of abstraction need to explain? I'm at the intersection of episodic and semantic memory. So jumping off a little bit of what Chris was mentioning, I think the phenomenon that jumps out at me is that we integrate our specific experiences of the world into a more abstract summary, otherwise often known as knowledge, which is somewhat unlike those original experiences that went into that summary. So our experiences are very rich in sensory detail. For example, these examples of pushing, they're very varied, and we can't possibly recall all of the sensory details, nor all of the individual experiences. So when we abstract into knowledge, we keep some of the important components where a lot of the work is on important, and try to summarize them and remove the irrelevant details. Some of the work on semantic memory that guides my thinking about this has really pointed out that what we retain tends to be relationally structured. although we recall other things about pushing, the things that inherently come up in the summary are a relational causal structure, such as an agent trying to cause a patient to move. And one of the funny things that Pinker pointed out in his book about verbs is that there are very few verbs that say that X happened and then Y happened accidentally at the same time. So causal structure has long been pointed out as a really important part of this, and Hafree and colleagues have shown that, for example, that even when processing visual scenes like this, we bring online this abstract causal structure that helps us recognize the agent-patient relationships pretty immediately. So the question that I have is, how do we learn such summaries? And as I sort of emphasized, relational inference is really potentially at the core of this, given that many of the things we retain are relations. And when processing an event, we recognize and learn about these relations, as well as we pull them out in our summaries. So we could see a cat running and a mouse running, but we instead see a cat chasing a mouse. And what's, I think, interesting to observe is that we have to make this inference. We have to compute the contingency by noting, for example, that the trajectories of the mouse and the cat are related. But noticing this contingency requires some inference and computation. Once we do that computation, we add an additional meaning, the relation, the fact of the relation, and we captured this notion of chasing. We can then generalize that relation to new instances where the participants might differ or some details vary. So I think that what we need to explain is how we discover relational structure as we summarize specific experiences. And so to answer the second question, I think what's useful to think about is what causal processes are actually giving rise to our sensory observation. And maybe these are the ones that we want to capture. So the fact that the cat and the mouse have their own individual intentions and motivations gives rise to this trajectory that they're taking. So I think that what we really want to do is capture the underlying causal process. So how do we study this? I'm not going to launch into any detail on this, but just as a brief overview of my work on this, I look at how we summarize experience and memory and in what ways these summaries are able to capture the relational structure underlying it. And I think there are interesting alternatives for what kind of relational structure our minds pick up on and summarize. One of the areas that I focused on recently is the idea of causality or contingency. So for example, I might have participants learn about relationships among pairs of images. These are arbitrary examples, not actual stimuli. But for example, you might see many instances of a mountain followed by a horse or a field followed by a skier, and all things held constant, you should be equally likely to remember them. But if you show additional images where, say, a beach also predicts the horse, that actually reduces the accuracy of how well you recall having seen mountain horse. And the reason is because it reduces the contingency value of the mountain because it's no longer a specific unique predictor of the horse. And this is a principle that's been pointed out in a long history of causal and computational learning theories. But what we were able to add to this picture is to say that this actually influences what you remember and what you forget. And so I sort of want to emphasize that there are principles about relational inference that impact how we summarize experiences in memory. And as one just other brief example, I think many of you are familiar by the seminal work of Gary Marcus on algebraic patterns, which basically shows that we're easily able to generalize between something like ABB and CDD, saying that these are more similar to each other than CDC because they capture this relational pattern where the last two elements are similar to or the same across different stimuli. And in a very, very minimal sort of demo, we were able to show that this governs what people remember. So I ask you to remember these images, which are also sort of made up, and then ask you, did you see this one? I'm not actually going to poll everybody, but many people would say they didn't see this one. But they will say that maybe they saw this one. In fact, they didn't, but because it follows the same algebraic pattern as the original they did see, there's a sort of false memory for it. So just to emphasize this point that I think that understanding how we infer relations can help us understand the nature of how we summarize our experiences and thus abstraction in long-term memory. And with that, thank you so much for listening. I look forward to your questions.
Very cool. Thank you, Anna. Are there any questions to Anna at this point?
Yeah, maybe one real quick one, Marcelo. Maybe Anna, this maybe also for Chris, like, how much do you think sort of these sort of relations that are being extracted from experiences is just really like an automatic sort of implicit sort of process? It seems like it's happening like very quickly that you can recognize something like chasing, for example.
Yeah, if I can jump in, I mean, that's absolutely what my work shows. I never guide people as to what they should look for, and I look for what kind of memory errors they make. And so this suggests that this is happening very automatically, at least in terms of the learning of them. In terms of retrieval, the work I mentioned by Hafri shows that it's also pretty automatic.
Yeah, I do think of it as usually pretty automatic. We do have a paper coming out hopefully like next week-ish of where we try to manipulate the extent to which people consciously pull up different event schemas. And we show that that can also have an impact in the way that things are structured. So I think it could be either way. I think I agree. It's usually something that you're automatically activating, but I think for many of these kinds of structures are also things that you have conscious access to.
Very cool. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, James, you want to?
Yeah, coming. So I should say straight away that I quite clearly didn't get the remit about the presentation. Okay, but I did manage to make this just so you at least have the questions in the background. Okay, but I apologize on my whatever it is. Okay, okay. First question. So, what concrete phenomena does a cognitive theory of abstraction need to explain? Well, I guess I'm getting much more cognitive than everyone here, and so I think the overarching principle, the overarching phenomena, that has to be about behavior. So whatever cognitive theory you have, it just has to be able to account for behaviors on a wide variety of cognitive tasks. That's like the guiding principle here, of course. And so then what sorts of behaviors are we talking about? Well, we're talking about abstraction here, and the benefit of abstraction is flexibility. That there's no point of abstracting something if it's not meant to help you about some other similar thing. So abstractions allow you to see similarities between different situations. So the sorts of things we need to account for like rapid successful decision-making of animals. This includes situations where the animal can immediately generalize knowledge, so it can immediately understand the similarity and behave. But it also needs to include situations where there's some learning still necessary. My abstraction should be able to put me in the best possible situation to learn new things. It doesn't just have to be this immediate generalization. And of course, I'm being pretty wishy-washy here, but the sorts of capabilities and phenomena that we should be trying to understand are like schemas, schema formation, reasoning, inferences, generalization, natural language, theories of mind. Those are the sorts of things that phenomena that we need to be thinking about, and the sorts of things that abstractions are quite clearly going to be extremely useful for. But I also care about neurons as well as behavior. So for me, a cognitive theory of abstraction really needs to explain when frontotemporal neurons fire in a rich and diverse arrangement of cognitive tasks. So the sort of thing I'm looking for is I'm looking for the same level of understanding of neurons and cognitive tasks, like the ones I mentioned, like schema formation, reasoning, inferences, generalization. I'm looking for the same level of understanding to those tasks, or the representations in those tasks of what we have in the hippocampal entorhinal system for spatial navigation. Can we understand the structure of neural representations that allow task generalization, as well as we understand how grid cells generalize spatial knowledge, for example. Okay, so I'm going to move on to my next slide. And so what characterizes useful abstractions in memory? So I'm sort of assuming here that we're talking about episodic memories. Otherwise, I could be a bit of a prat and just say that semantic memories, because that covers essentially all abstractions. Okay, but for episodic memories, again, sort of usefulness of abstractions here is about how you go about structuring your memories so they can be retrieved in useful ways. And the previous two people spoke about that very, very nicely. But the sorts of abstractions that I care about are things like factorization, compositional binding, hierarchies. Okay, and why are those things useful? Well, if you can structure your memories out of these factorized building blocks, it's particularly useful for generalization because it allows your memories to be constructive. I can take two of these factors and I can bind them together in a never seen before combination, and I can store that together as a new memory, like a new thing that I can store. I can build new things in memories if I do that. The factorization is also, of course, very helpful for memory retrieval. I can just content address my memory system by just one of those factors, and then hopefully I should be able to retrieve the other factor or complete the full memory. This is, of course, pattern completion. Absolutely crucial for generalization and flexible behavior. And so that was sort of factorization and compositionality. But of course, hierarchical abstractions are totally fundamental. You can have hierarchical control over your memories. I may not want to retrieve everything about a situation, or there might be components further down the hierarchy that can get reused across many different memories. That's of course going to be very helpful for memory retrieval too. So those factors, those three things: factorization, compositionality, constructive binding, hierarchies, and then lastly, of course, memory isn't just about storing it away and retrieving it in the moment. I want to be able to replay my memories offline so I can learn from them. I can learn, my semantic memory system can learn the abstractions from them. So I really need to be able to think, I don't know the answer for this, but I really need to be thinking about what are the right abstractions so I can structure my memory so that they can be replayed at a later date and build better abstractions on top of them. I don't know what the answer to that is, but that's quite clearly extremely important thing. Okay, well, that was me and my 2 slides. So yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, James. Anyone wants to ask a question to James before we move on to our 4th speaker? It seems like we're doing well on time, so any questions? All right, so let's move on to our 4th speaker. Alexa, you have your slides up already. Thank you.
Hi. Okay, you guys can hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me. This workshop has already been really great to hear about. So I wanted to start actually by kind of pointing out what everyone has already alluded to a little bit, which is that already not even thinking about across different domains like memory, language, perception, motor, etc. Even within memory, what it means to be an abstraction is thought about really differently, right? So we have these ideas about abstractions of events, kind of relational structures or order of events, right? Schemas and scripts. I can be the Pratt and say that we can count semantic memory here, right? So we abstract across different experiences of objects and exemplars to generate categories and concepts. And then we can even think of things like cognitive maps as abstracted representations of physical or really any sort of dimensional spaces, right? These are just like a few examples of how we think of abstraction in memory, which I think makes it difficult, but also really exciting to think about what common principles we can kind of extract across all of them. Something that I think about a lot is, especially in memory, all of these forms of abstractions take place across really rich multi-elemental and multi-dimensional experiences. So one question that we can have is, well, at what level of detail should we even be abstracting? And at what point is it meaningful to preserve details of specific events or specific items, right? So if we take the idea of a birthday party, we know that birthday parties usually have these specific components, right? Cakes, decorations, a certain kind of class of colors, right? Like brightly decorated colors. But at the same time, right, like even one person whose memories of their birthdays, you know, they vary over the years. They have different people in them. They take place at different locations. Work versus with friends, like there are all these variations that are also meaningful, like personally meaningful for people to hang on to. So when I think about what phenomena a cognitive theory of abstraction needs to explain, I'm thinking really specifically about when we encounter a new experience, what's the balance between relying on or incorporating that new experience into a prior abstraction versus how much we should be retaining detail and keeping that experience as distinct. I think the boundary case here, like the balance between these two questions, is something that a cognitive theory should be able to answer for us. So I kind of wanted to give a little case example of how I've been thinking about that in my past work. I use category typicality a lot as a way to kind of probe these boundary cases, basically probe when it's useful or applicable to rely on abstracted knowledge versus when it actually can be harmful. So in these studies, participants learn and retrieve the locations of images. Here I'm putting in words, a stand-in for the images, but the idea here is that a lot of the images are clustered by their category membership. So in this example, participants can abstract over learning multiple image locations that the majority of birds belong in the top left corner of the screen, for example. And so their performance for those birds is really great because it's really easy to lean on that abstraction that they've just learned. They remember that the flamingo goes up there kind of with the rest of the birds. But what I'm interested in is how people treat new experiences that conflict with this abstraction. So items that are kind of exceptions to this rule, birds that are located amongst other animals, right, far away from other birds. And I specifically look at category typicality as a way of kind of assessing the similarity between these new instances and an abstraction that people have learned. And we find that category typicality can kind of govern how people remember and misremember these items. So first of all, performance, location knowledge, location memory for these items is worse relative to items that are kind of clustered together with other category members. But we find that typical category members are actually misremembered to be even closer to their category cluster relative to atypical category members, right? So just the similarity of a new experience relative to an abstraction can kind of dictate how much people come to rely on that abstraction, even when it's not necessarily useful. We also test participants on their memory for specific details or kind of idiosyncratic details of each image. So we ask people to choose exactly which cardinal or exactly which toucan they saw it encoding and then put it in the encoded location. And we actually find that people's memory of atypical category members is better than the typical ones. Again, because this might be a case where an abstraction that hasn't been newly learned isn't actually useful to apply here. And so it's kind of better for people to process atypical category members more kind of concretely and more deeply and kind of preserve that idiosyncratic knowledge because it doesn't fit in with the abstraction. So these are the kinds of the things that I've been working on to understand exactly when an abstraction is useful and to what extent it could be useful. It's not exactly a yes or no question of whether or not you should totally disregard your prior knowledge or your abstracted knowledge, or you should totally rely on it. It could be something more continuous, more based on the similarity of the new experience and your prior abstracted knowledge. But yeah, so in general, like looking at these boundary cases of when an abstraction should be applied, I think is something that's really critical for any cognitive theory of abstraction. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Alexa. Cool. Any questions to Alexa specifically at this point before we transition to the phase 2? All right, so we're gonna start our more discussion part of the seminar, and at this phase, anyone can chime in with questions, including the speakers themselves if they have questions for each other. And to begin, I actually have a question to any of you who might be interested in answering. My question is, memory is special, I guess, in comparison to other to the other types of abstraction that we study, in the sense that it communicates information across time, right? So there's the time of encoding, there's a time of retrieval, and a whole period of time that may elapse between the two, where you may even modify the memory, as James was actually alluding to. So how do you see abstraction as happening in each one of these stages? We could talk about abstraction at the encoding phase, abstraction at the retrieval phase, or maybe the modification that is happening. Do you see abstraction at each one of these levels as maybe achieving the same goal, or maybe being computationally distinct from one another? Anna?
Yeah, so I think that maybe I have a weird answer to this, which is I really want to look at the part in between, right? Like, I think it's a little bit, well, there's a lot of, there's work on memory integration, but I think it's sort of like this less visible part of it. We sort of observe people encoding, we observe people retrieving, but to me, the things that we abstract over kind of often emerge by integrating across experiences and discovering those commonalities. There are some things that just are not in any individual experience, like the mean. And so to me, the focus is on in between.
Well, I guess I just have a very pointless comment to say, but it's not totally clear to me what yeah, it's not totally clear to me what exists outside of time. Okay, so I know it's true that memories are, they've had this special place there apparently communicating information over long periods of time, but it's not, yeah, it sort of seems that every part of the brain has to do that. It might be the case that memories do that in a slightly more fancy way, but yeah, I was just,
or like longer periods of time, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, so Anna said that she has a question to ask as well, so I'm happy to have you ask your question, and then we'll open for the audience.
Great. Yeah, I have maybe two related, similar or different questions for a few of us. Specifically, Alexa and Chris versus me, not to leave James out, but we had like slightly contrasting, but maybe actually the same sort of points. So for Chris, I'm wondering if you think that there is a fundamental difference between optimizing for predictive accuracy versus what I was saying as like the importance of getting the right causal generative model. And so maybe I'll just start with that point. Like, does anybody feel like these are fundamentally in tension? And Chris, what do you think? Are they saying kind of the same thing fundamentally, or do they make different predictions that we could test?
Yeah, I think that I'm like 100% agreeing with the way you're framing it, so that the useful predictions that you're going to make are going to be ones where you like have correctly inferred that causal structure, right? And then you can use that inferred model to make predictions about the future. So I think I mostly agree. I guess I do think maybe there could be cases where you can make predictions even without a causal structure per se, that you can make predictions about things that are like associated, or right, that outcomes that tend to happen even if you don't really have a causal model exactly, right? I can imagine more like sort of model free associative kinds of things that's like that would allow you to make predictions about what's going to come up next, even if you don't understand the mechanisms of how it happens. And I could also see maybe that some of this changes over the course of learning, that initially when you're in an environment, you might be able to make predictions without actually understanding that causal structure. And then as you become more of an expert, you actually understand like what the structure is. And you could, an advantage of understanding that structure is that you can better generalize to new kinds of actions, or right, you can make better predictions about things that you haven't seen before. So yeah, so I think that's certainly one, and maybe the best way to make predictions is having that causal structure, but I think it could be other things too.
Yeah, it reminds me of sort of some demonstrations in both developmental and also like older adults or clinical populations demos, where there's actually sometimes an over-reliance on surface features. So in some conditions, participants retain this sort of like heuristic of, let's say, categorizing anything that's moving as alive and these kinds of things. So, there is this like lure of fast and frugal surface features that kind of fly in the face of that, but they seem to be exceptions. So
And did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, in my list of things, I also noted that I thought I really liked, Alexa, how you opened with the, like, here are different ways that like memory researchers have described abstraction. I love that. But I wonder also, to what extent do you think these are very different? In my view, kind of all concepts have some amount of schema in them. I don't know, like, is there a real difference? Or are we just saying that concepts of events sometimes look different than concepts of concrete object categories, which might have some differences in content, but fundamentally they all share similar principles?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the boundaries between any of those phenomenon are super blurry if they exist at all. And I totally think that there are going to be common underlying principles across them. It's just kind of, I mean, yeah, it's interesting. It's like based on what? It's sort of something objecty versus something more relation-y, you know, it just like all of these definitions are a little bit blurry. But it's kind of funny to see that like people have kind of spawned entire different literatures based on these different subtopics. I mean, I agree with you. I think what you would say is that there's more in common with them than there are differences. What I think is interesting, though, and maybe particular to memory, is that you can kind of have abstractions across these different like forms of information, or even like levels of complexity within a memory or across memories. And that's another question, I think, about like at what level of granularity does it make sense to form an abstraction? Like Chris talked about, you know, we know what to expect when ordering at a restaurant, or we know what a restaurant context looks like. But we also know what like a fast food restaurant is versus a fancy restaurant versus a like barbecue tent at a fair, right? So I don't know. It's like at what level of detail should we even start at is another interesting question.
Cool.
Well, I should say the you know the cognitive the level of detail you have to describe is the one that appropriately accounts for behavior. That's the boring answer. But then the question to try to go down there, then you have to think about what are then like the minimal requirements of a model or an agent or some sort of machine that can then enact that behavior. And then if you can understand those sort of minimal environment, not necessarily minimal, what are the ways in which you can enact that behavior, then you can start thinking about what are the actual abstractions you can start using. But yeah, I just think that everything has to be grounded in behavior. So it's like when your guys were talking about causal models and stuff, that's all very well, but you're obviously not going to build a causal model if it's not useful. And so yeah, so yeah.
Wai Keen, I know you've had your hand up. Do you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, so I guess a bunch of you, you know, distinctly from some of the other seminars we've organized, are sort of like do more neural work, collect neural data and things like that. I'm curious if you have much to say on, say, like the neural bases of abstraction. Yeah.
I'm happy to talk about the neural bases of abstraction. I guess I don't really know where to start. Yeah. I'm not sure where. I'm admittedly not really sure where to start though.
I guess maybe for some of your work, James, like things like grid cells. Like, do you think of grid cells, say, as like a form of like spatial abstraction? And if so, does that mean that abstraction is sort of like occurring sort of like at the sort of single neuron, or sort of like, you know, at a very low level in the brain? Yeah.
I mean, certainly from the entorhinal cortex, it looks that way. Yeah, you find cells which have the same sort of response properties across a variety of different situations. Like a grid cell or the grid population preserves its phase tuning across different environments. It's not like a random smattering. It preserves something. Therefore, something has been abstracted. The object vector cells, these are cells that have a certain vectoral firing to objects. They're still an object vector cell in another environment. There's quite clearly something going on there. And there's a curiosity of entorhinal cortex, of which, of course, this is like heavily debated. And but a curiosity is that it really does seem like there are single cell types that do single types of abstractions. It looks like you've got a population that is decomposed into building blocks, like a building block for space, a building block for borders, a building block for this, and any new situation, then it's just a different combination, a different rearrangement of those building blocks. It's like a factorized code, but where the factors really are in different neurons. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's what it looks like. So that is a particularly attractive neural representation, because it really, as I said, it really does look like building blocks in different neurons that can be combined in different ways. And presumably hippocampus is crucial for that, because entorhinal cortex is sitting right next to hippocampus, and hippocampus, I guess, is binding these things together and these different combinations and storing memories of them. How that sort of thing generalizes to more interesting bits of the brain than entorhinal cortex is a bit of an unknown. Like, is it the case that you find these beautiful building block type things for more abstract things, like maybe some wacky task has different components, and those components can be rearranged in some compositional way. Maybe when I'm doing my route planning, I often do this route, but I sometimes do that one and this one, but this is the sort of behaviors I do, I could, you know, chunk and put them on top of each other and move them around. So like compositional planning, basically. Is it the case that there's some building blocky neural representation for that? We just don't know. There's like evidence that there's definitely you can find things like in parietal cortex where single cells care about single things, but you can also find situations where single cells apparently care about multiple things. It's like a hard to tease. Yeah, it's hard to know there. But I don't. I can talk more about this, but maybe I should stop.
Maybe I can jump in. I really appreciate James starting us off on this answer, because I knew you would say entorhinal cortex, which is awesome. And I see the same thing, is the importance of it for generating very rapidly newly integrated summaries of experience that are quite general. But what I've observed in some of my recent work at UC Davis that will come out very soon in the cerebral cortex is that we actually see that sort of abstraction function that we see in entorhinal cortex, at least the one that I studied, later emerging in a semantic memory area in the middle temporal gyrus. And I think the sort of the question that I came into this study with was, you know, we don't think that the entorhinal cortex stores all of the knowledge we acquire. So although it's critical for that initial formation, somehow that has to distribute out to semantic memory areas eventually. So yeah, I think there's some good evidence for that process.
Well, sort of like anatomically, so it has to be the case as well. It's true that the main inputs into hippocampus are entorhinal cortex. So I'm sure entorhinal cortex operates as a bit of a hub to other, you know, higher level cortical areas. But it's not, the converse isn't true. Hippocampus projects everywhere. Okay, so yeah. But like what the question, I'm just gonna repeat myself. Like the question of like, is there some transferable understanding that we have from? I think we have a reasonably good understanding of this compositionality and abstraction in that, you know, tiny little brain area. But are there some principles there that we can translate to other brain areas and abstractions in more complicated tasks? I think that's like a great question. I hope there is. I'm sure there is.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was muted. Yes, Judy, you can go next.
Cool, this has been super fun. Okay, so you could say that everything the brain is doing over time as it accumulates experience is like memory, right? But the pragmatics of like holding today's seminar in the context of some of the other sessions that we've had so far as part of the, you know, this workshop, is that there's like something about memory, like there's like a virtue that like is implied in like having a good memory, that they like hold on to idiosyncratic detail, right? It's like about particulars, like more so than like maybe some of the other sessions, like they're explicitly about causality, or like maybe explicitly about like nameable concepts in language, you know. And I was curious to hear like, you know, when we maybe in more lay context talk about someone having a good memory, the point is that they don't forget things, right? They like abstract away from experiences less, right, than someone with a less good memory, I suppose. Okay, so like, how do you all think about the difference between just like forgetting as such and like abstraction, which is like maybe a good way of putting maybe the same, like how can you tell, given some phenomenon where something has been lost, that you're looking at like something that's like abstraction with sprinkle, like as opposed to just forgetting, and like what are the kind of theoretical tools that you use in order to like handle one kind of like to explain forgetting versus abstraction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Oh, go ahead, Alexa.
I love that question. I think it's really important to think about the line between, or exactly how much is useful to forget versus remember, basically. I think you can think of as abstraction as a regression line, right? Like there is a best fit across a lot of different experiences that you have where it makes sense to retain some amount of information. I think there are some strong claims in the field where I think some people would say that you have to forget some components of an experience in order to generalize. I don't necessarily agree with that, actually, but it's out there. But yeah, I mean, I am starting to come around to the idea that like having a good memory isn't necessarily the ability to really retain specific details about a particular event. I think you could also argue that no one even does that veridically. Like to some extent, our specific memories of specific events have also to some extent been abstracted and kind of generalized, like on itself, right? That's the idea of a memory becoming semanticized over time. So yeah, I mean, I guess the answer for me is I don't really know what the right balance is between forgetting and abstraction, but it's important and someone should figure it out.
Cool, thank you. Any follow-up to this question before we move on to other questions? I don't know if they raised hands are about this question specifically. Yes?
Yeah, actually, I did generate an answer, even though I'm really not an episodic memory researcher. So I was like very self-conscious about this, presenting at this seminar. But I think that actually my answer is hierarchy. So I think that if you just randomly forget, that may be not helpful, but if you want to retain all the details, if you organize everything hierarchically so that you can both say, here are the attributes of like museums in general, and then here are the attributes of this museum underneath that, and here's the attributes of this museum when I went to it last week. Like if you can organize it appropriately, then you can flexibly handle recall at any level, and then you'd be a memory master, while also retaining abstraction because it's organized. But that's a naive answer, and I haven't studied this, and I hope we do.
Yeah, I was just going to briefly say I don't know if remembering lots of specific details about the past is necessarily helpful. I think some kinds of memory pathology look a lot like that. Things like versions of PTSD look a lot like that, where you are activating things in the past that the features are actually not relevant to your current situation. There's a great This American Life episode just put in the chat of like talking to people that have highly superior autobiographical memory and them talking about how terrible it is for their lives, that they really have difficulty like not dwelling on past events, and that they overgeneralize things that happened in the past. And so, I think in some ways that having a great memory in that way, I don't know if it's the most useful. But I think there's certainly a bad kind of forgetting where you don't have access to the abstractions that are most useful, right? And so there's this sort of middle ground of you want to sort of like forget the things that are not going to recur in the future, right? Which is a really difficult thing, but I think that's a really great question.
So I just have one.
Yeah, go on, James.
Oh, no, well, if you were going to reply to Chris, you should go first, then I can go.
Yeah, just like a quick reply. It's just that we also often view episodic memory as just kind of keeping all of the details. But I mean, realistically, there's also some level of abstraction that happens at the encoding time. And you only, even immediately after some episode, you might already have forgotten some of the very precise details of what were where and so on. So I think that there's like some level of abstraction happening at encoding, and then semanticization that happens afterwards, which you may keep multiple levels of abstraction, all of those amazing things that came up, but just wanted to tie back to the encoding phase as well. So James, do you mind waiting because there was Daniel Kimmel had his hand raised before. So Daniel, do you want to go next?
I don't know if it was important. I was going to reply to the question.
Oh, you were. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. I It wasn't a generic question, yeah. So I think there's two, sorry, I will try to go fast so Daniel gets to talk. Okay, so I think there's two sorts of types of episodic memory, or the sort of memory of specific events we might want to decouple in this sense. And that's, I'll decouple it in a moment, but this idea of forgetting and generalization obviously relates to this memorization versus generalization problem in machine learning, and like overfitting essentially. But that isn't the only type of memorization that you and I do. We also memorize like these shortish, not necessarily short term, but shortish term memories, which is highly, highly important to allow us to generalize. Like if you and I haven't remembered our experiences in the last few days, then we wouldn't be able to learn and abstract from them, okay? But it might become pathological if we over remember these things that we've learned in the past few days, and so then we can't abstract from them. So like this idea of like memory and realization and forgetting is sort of weird in the brain, because we have this additional thing like replay. Okay, so it's absolutely crucial to have a good memory in order to abstract, but then there might be some pathological situations where you just over remember things and don't abstract. And so there's some decoupling there, which would be my guess of what a good memory is that you remember things so that you are able to abstract from those memories, and then you forget those memories. Okay, but if you that's okay.
Thank you. Daniel?
Yeah, hi everyone. Can you thumbs up? You can hear me? Yeah. Thanks so much for organizing this. I'm an assistant professor at Columbia, and I work with Daphne Shahami and Stefano Fusi, among others. And so this stuff is near and dear to my heart. I actually had a separate question, but I did have an answer to Judy's question, if I can kind of tag that on too. So one thing that we think about is the geometry of neural representation in the brain that supports abstraction versus other forms of cognitive flexibility. And one of the things that Stefano, who would really be the one to speak about this, has shown in simulations is that abstraction and forgetting are not necessarily synonymous. That is, you can, if you think of abstraction as a form of dimensionality reduction, which is throwing out information, you can do that in some dimensions, but maintain information in others. And that seems to be really important so that you can do, for example, discrimination amongst different instances, even if they share a lot of features. But it also seems really important for doing abstractions in the future, where the shared features might be something different than the shared features that you seem relevant to you now, which is a little bit like James's point, which is that you need to maintain rich memories in order to like do offline abstractions. And so that we're designing some tasks to get at this, to try and push the brain, or to push the subject, human subjects, in both directions. That is, asking them to hold representations that are good for abstraction and hold representations that are good for flexibility in the future, and seeing if that's possible, outside of simulations, and seeing kind of what mitigates the balance between those things. So I think it's a really important question, and it turns out not to be super straightforward, I think. The other question I wanted to ask is that, when we think about abstracting amongst different instances, when we're talking oftentimes about shared features that themselves may be kind of special to that instance, so memory becomes important, or I should say bound to that instance, and sort of independentness of the other instances, such a way that memory becomes important because we might not observe all those instances simultaneously. And so we got to like hang on to one so that we can learn the shared features of another one. But there's another way in which memory can be important, where the shared feature itself is temporal, meaning like the thing that links the different instances is time itself, or is the temporal relationship or temporal statistics between them. I mean, so Chris's example at the restaurant with the waiter, I mean, like what allows us to do the abstraction is the order of events that happen there. And so the question I was wondering about is if we think about time as being a different type of shared feature, on which we might abstract, is there something special about that? Is there something special about temporal abstraction, either insofar as sort of the constraints it places on sort of the sort of behaviors that we can do abstraction on, or in terms of the kinds of neural underpinnings that are necessary in order to do time-based abstractions?
So my guess is it's all pretty similar. There might be, it depends a little bit about what you're talking about, temporal abstractions. So there might, in Chris's example, I can't remember exactly Chris's example, but the classic example is, you go to a restaurant and then you give them some food and get their receipt, etc. That's some set of things that have taken place over time that you can abstract the idea of what it gives to go to a restaurant from. So my guess is that that sort of thing is totally identical. to any other sort of, well, not totally identical, of course, but like other sorts of relational abstractions that's very, very similar to. Then there's other things that happen in time where it really does follow time, like day, like, morning, lunch, dinner, and so on, where the order of events are the same time goes between each thing. And so it's now you're not doing a generalization over different delays effectively, you're doing a generalization over sequential time, which is always runs at the same rate. I suspect that is possibly a little bit different because you don't have to generalize over different time periods, okay? But yeah, so I imagine there's some slight difference between like literally clockwork generalization and this non-clock generalization over abstraction over time.
Anna?
Yeah, I also wasn't completely sure what I think generalization over time could mean different things, but I'll just point out in the neural mechanisms, one dissociation that's really interesting is between lateral and anterior lateral and posterior medial aspects of the entorhinal cortex, which seem to focus primarily on temporal versus spatial relational memory. So I think there's some neural dissociations between time and space that are really interesting in the literature.
Any other thoughts on this question? Yunwoo, are you asking, is it a follow-up to this or a new question?
Hi, actually, I have a new question. Is that okay?
I think so. Yeah, you can go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Hi, I'm an AI researcher working at the Allen Institute for AI, and thanks for all the awesome workshop and discussions. I have a really simple question that I'm kind of getting confused. I know that these episodic memories eventually get abstracted away, but those episodic memories kind of get retrieved, or should I say reconstructed, when given the cue of those abstracted knowledge. So I was kind of getting confused about, like, because of the previous question, that those forgetting and abstractions are kind of different. So in my sense, I thought like those abstracted knowledges or memories are kind of stored separately with the episodic memories. But now I hear like some parts of episodic memories gets forgotten, and those are kind of transitioned to abstract knowledges. So is there this distinction like between those forgotten or abstracted away semantic knowledges and the episodic memories? Like,
Yeah, there's been many ongoing fights about this kind of issue in the memory literature, and yeah, at least one sort of classic idea is that you do over time these episodic memories do get transitioned to something that's more abstract and actually resides in different brain structures. And so there's, at least with rodents, you can do things like show that there's brain regions that sort of initially support memories, but then if you wait long enough and then you mess up those brain regions, the memories seem fine, so they went somewhere else. But again, there's lots of debate about whether they really move completely or in what way. But yeah, I think it's actually one of the ways that there's a big gap between what we know about the brain and the way most of these AI systems work, right? That have things like replay buffers that like the memories just stay episodic forever, right? And so it could be that this is just a human brain limitation that we can't do that, and so we're forced to compress things. And there is a conversation in the chat going on about this too. Or it could be that there's actually some advantage to this, right? It's related to this the usefulness of these abstractions, is that you do want to compress your memories into some more useful format that prioritizes the features that are actually going to be relevant for the future, and just keeping around all of these separate episodic memories in their original form is not as helpful.
so can I kind of like treat these abstract knowledges as indices for these episodic memories, like to be retrieved or reconstructed?
That's what, yeah, it's one possibility, is that you do like keep a lot of these memories around and you just sort of group them up in some way. But I think probably the more standard idea is that you do actually lose access to these original features. So it's more that you actually created some new kind of abstraction. You're not just indexing to which of the relevant memories.
But there is like an old time. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Okay, you can finish it up if you want. Okay.
No, you can.
I was gonna say there is like an old time a theory called hippocampal indexing theory, which is exactly that. Your hippocampal memories, they index these different bits of cortex, these different bits of abstractions, and it binds together all the different things. Oh, like where was I doing, etc. And binds it together as in some hippocampal index. That's true. That's one, just to relate to what you said. But maybe to relate to you as an AI researcher, sort of distinction between episodic-like memory and the semantic memory would be thinking of a transformer, the sort of things that are within your context. That's going to be something a bit more like an episodic memory, a sort of particular item that I've veridically remembered. I think that happened 20 time steps ago, but I'm just keeping it as right there. And the distinction, and that versus an episodic memory, which would be the weights you've learned in your feed-forward network part of your transformer, the sort of semantic component. Yeah, so that's the sort of relation there.
Thank
I'll
you.
just jump in. I'll just jump in to say that I totally agree with Chris's answer. I think that there's a problem with indexing where like you can't index to something that's an emergent property of multiple integrated experiences. Well, I mean, I guess you could index to that, but if you're just indexing to individual experiences, like where do you get that overall integrated content? So to me, indexing theory fails on accounting for that. So I think there definitely has to be generated abstractions elsewhere.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, James, for your comments. So we're at time, 2 minutes past. So thank you so much to everyone for attending, for contributing your questions. Again, we'll be compiling some of these results at the conference next week. If you're able to attend in person, that would be wonderful. If not, some of this will also appear in our website, so you can follow up there as well. Thank you so much to everyone, and see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. This is fantastic.
Thank you, everyone.